My name is Charlie Art. I have a blog at RadicalProgress.info, which is some things I've written about my philosophy of social change and social issues. I've been doing blogging or writing of this kind since forever, at least since the 90s on the internet, and I thought it was time that I tried a video blog. So to get started, I'm going to read one of the things I've written, connected with RadicalProgress.info, and hopefully, from there, maybe get into more original video blogs. So I'm going to start with an autobiographical essay that I wrote in the early 2000s. This was probably just before 9/11. So I hope you find something interesting in here. For some reason, I always go back to the year of my birth, as if that explains something about my adult self. 1963 was the year that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. Now, although I was just an infant, I've always felt that I imbibed that utopian spirit of the 60s. I didn't actually hear that sermon until I was around 12. But when I did hear it, it was just one more confirmation of the utopian mindset. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be brought low. The rough places shall be made smooth or plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. So that paragraph is based on a biblical passage, which is pretty utopian one in the Bible. I've never failed to be inspired by those sorts of Bible passages. However, I have found that that message isn't necessarily the dominant one in the Bible. There is plenty of pessimism in the Bible, and what I have come to since believe are some backward ideas as well. It seems like my life has been about journeying from pessimism towards the utopianism. My father was also a preacher, a Pentecostal hellfire and brimstone preacher. There was no heaven on earth for him. He preached against the liberals, the communists, the feminists, and the peaceniks. In essence, against everything that I eventually came to embrace. And that is the story in itself. So, after I graduated from high school in 1981, I did attend a Pentecostal college, and it was there that I began my first thinking outside of the pessimistic viewpoint that I'd inherited. The first break came over something that might be considered minor and obscure outside of my Pentecostal ghetto, but it was pretty significant for me in that context. The standard Pentecostal doctrine was that Jesus was going to rapture all the real Christians from the earth and leaving behind the majority of human beings to face the Great Tribulation. The horrors of Armageddon, massive earthquakes, plagues, and fiery comets would rain down on earth for 7 years. I came to believe that God wouldn't deprive earth of his best servants during earth's darkest hours. I believe that Christians would face the Antichrist and would be used by God to resist evil's power. This made me a heretic and a radical. After all, being a Christian was about saving souls, not about helping people in this life. I had begun my long journey in rejecting a deeply ingrained world hatred. I didn't return to college for another 7 years. Now, before I left college, I did manage to meet and fall in love with my future wife, Teresa. She seemed intrigued by my radicalism in contrast to most of the other students and teachers. One of my few campus radical buddies was her good friend, and that probably made it easier for her to accept me. We became good friends while touring with the college choir, and eventually a romance blossomed. We married in 1982 and began a search for whatever utopia we could find together. I was still finding inspiration in the Bible, and this time I found it in Acts 4:32. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul. No one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. 4 years later, Teresa and I moved to Evanston, Illinois to become part of a Christian community, Reba Place Fellowship, which utilized the common treasury. Just before that move, a new kind of love came into my life in a very pure form. My daughter Melissa was born on October 10th, 1985. My father once said to me that he'd never felt truly adored until my little sister was born. I now know what that means. Even though I've always felt like fathering was challenging, I still see in my children, my son who was born a few years later, this my truest legacy. No job or masterpiece I could ever create will have the same impact or meaning as my children on the world and on life. Let me digress a little bit about fatherhood. My own father, as may be obvious by now, was an angry and unhappy person and abusive towards his wife and children. We led a double life, with Dad preaching Jesus and salvation in the church, and then giving us pain and unhappiness at home. Now, although I'd had an instant bond with my own daughter when my son Christopher was born, it was harder to feel that same affection. I can't recall my father expressing genuine love for me, and I had to work through resistance. My father's patterns of short-tempered lashing out still lurk in my subconscious. So returning to my story at Reba Place, it was there that I was first challenged to look at the pain and suffering of my childhood. After one of my angry rage outbursts was directed right at my little girl, and I had no choice, I had to get into therapy. I was diagnosed with depression and began an 8-year pursuit of emotional healing. And there were 2 important breakthroughs in my therapy. First of all, I reconnected with my inner child in a very intense therapy session. Now, I know this idea is scoffed at, and our session didn't start with that goal. We were just revisiting a pivotal, abusive childhood memory. And as we worked through the memories in the therapy, it became clear that a part of myself had been deeply damaged and unable to cope with that experience. It was only as I embraced the abused child within myself that I began to heal from that pain. The second breakthrough was more ordinary. I'd been placed on antidepressants as far back as 1987, but they'd all had limited effects on me. Not long after 87, of course, Prozac was released, and I didn't try it right away. I took it up later, but when I did, it immediately worked its famous magic on me. Within a few months, all my depressive thoughts subsided, and I knew that I was fully cured. That's not the typical case, but I've been symptom-free for many years. I do not know how much of a factor that earlier inner child breakthrough was, but my guess is that they reinforce each other. Not long after this, my life at Reba Place came to an end. My new emotional health gave me a new freedom in religious matters, and for all its good things, Reba Place was still holding on to some traditions and ideas that had begun to feel constricting to me. My journey towards a utopia was taking a new turn. Reba Place had been part of the Mennonite Church, or was and still is part of the Mennonite Church, which is a biblically based peace church. And I've been drawn there as much by pacifism as by the communal lifestyle. Now, as I began to go through more serious questioning of the Bible and Christian doctrines, including doubts about Jesus' divinity and resurrection, the nature of God, the authority of the Bible, I was still a pacifist, still religious, but I needed to find a new community that could accommodate someone given to heretical ideas about religion. Now, I found that community in another Utopian sect, the Religious Society of Friends, commonly called Quakers. Now, Quakers started out with a biblical basis similar to the Mennonites, but modernism and unorthodox ideas became much more accepted among Quakers about 100 years ago or so. Many Quakers had been involved in the had been involved in the struggle for the abolition of slavery, and this experience had sort of undermined the Quaker culture as a world-shunning perfectionist sect. They shifted from their vision of communal perfection, at least one branch did, and embraced a new one of social service and activism. This new focus brought Quakers into contact with unorthodox ideas about the Bible and Christianity. Quakers had undergone splits regarding doctrine, but the faction that embraced modern activism and modern theology today is now one of the most theologically diverse religious bodies in the U.S. I pretty quickly located the closest Quaker meeting to my home and began attending in 1997. Among Quakers, I found a community that I believe could be my spiritual home for the rest of my life. They're far from perfect, but part of my healing has been accepting imperfection in myself and in others. I'm still longing for utopia. A.J. Muste, who is the pacifist founder of the Fellowship for Reconciliation, once remarked that his demonstrations against war were not only about changing the world, they were also intended to keep the world from changing him. That resonates with how I regard my utopian spirit. While I have been changed in many times in many ways, it seems these changes have always aimed at purifying the utopian impulse. The 1960s still stand out for me as a period of history when lots of people discovered a vision of a better world. They failed to realize it completely, but I believe the world is better for that vision having dawned in the lives that it did. So, as for where my utopian impulse will take me next, that's something of a mystery to me, as it's been all along. I know that one of my real gifts is writing, and there's much to be written about the details of utopian visions. I've had a couple of articles published and really hope one day to write a longer book on my experience in philosophy. I hope that helps you understand a little bit about what I'm doing with the RadicalProgress.info blog, because the writing that I do there is an extension of writing about utopian impulses. I hope you like this blog, and stay tuned for more. Thanks.